Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Horror Analysis with me, Drew. Oops. One more time. Hi. Alright. Today we're still on History of Horror, and we are into the 1990s. Going back, as I'm doing a chronological history. And I'll do that for the next one as well, in the 80s. And then it's going to switch up a bit because we'll be going into the bulk now of Dance Macabre in the 70s, 60s, 50s era. I'm using this version, of course. There we go. So you can read all the words. This one we're still going over a bit today because we have the essay What's Scary? And when he discusses some movies, he only discusses movies really in this one. In that essay, he discusses from 95 to 2010 when he wrote the essay. The previous 15 years. So the first half of the 90s, I'm sort of on my own. I have my hot water, and I have my notes here. Yes, as I said, I'm also using the video by Josh Howard on YouTube, the Philosophy of Horror video that he does. It's useful for some of the history stuff, and I do appreciate it for some of the history stuff because there's not a lot of history of horror out there, so it's helpful to have as much as he has. He calls the 80s and 90s, which I don't know why he combines them together, but I think they do fit together. New slashers and sequels and vampires. Later 90s, beginning of the beginning of the zombie era, which of course I talked about last time. Mostly in the 2000s, so we'll be hopefully ending the zombie madness soon, the zombie everything, and something else might take its place. Don't know what it is. As I discussed last time, a lot of the zombie hoopla, a lot of the appeal of the zombies for the post 9/11 world is seeing people trying to destroy your way of life in an unthinking manner, as relating to zombies, and not caring about death as relating to zombies. And you have the Republican idea, I suppose, since King sees horror as a Republican median, of we have to fight him over there, so we don't have to fight him over here. I think, King's quote is, "Beat him or bird him, the only way to stop him is put a bullet in the head and steer clear of the twitchers." Which is how Americans were viewing Muslim terrorists as well during the 2000s. But we're done with the 2000s. We're not really into zombies yet. We're into the 90s. And the 90s, according to Howard anyway, it's going to have a lot of slashers and sequels and a lot of vampires. And you know what? He's basically right. Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Dracula that has Gary Oldman as Dracula, came out in 92. Interview with a Vampire came out in 96. Why do I not have that on my list? I suppose I don't. What did he have? He had Interview in 96. Fright Night was, of course, earlier. Lost Boys was in the 80s, and Fright Night was in the 80s. From Dusk Till Dawn is one that King talks about. That was 96. The Bordello of Blood, the night of Tales from the Crypt was in 96 as well, and essentially that's the same. They have the same plot. Um, two Tales from the Crypt movies. The other one was Demon Knight with Vin Diesel. Um, that was 95. A lot of. I will add to this list. I guess it started earlier. I guess it did start in the 90s, but the teen horror. Well, it started in the 50s if you want to go back that far, but the resurgence from the 50s type of teen horror. You could say that the first Nightmare on Elm Street with Johnny Depp as the young Johnny Depp sort of pushed that forward again. But in the 90s, there was so many. There was the I Know What You Did Last Summer's 1 and 2. There was Scream 1, 2, 3. Urban Legends, The Craft, The Faculty. Um, as teen stars in horror movies. And there's probably quite a few more that I haven't even thought of, but I, you know, so that definitely had a huge resurgence in the mid to early 90s. The Craft was 96. Oh, I thought The Craft was earlier. Faculty was 98. So I guess mid 90s. I Know What You Did Last Summer was 97. I Still Know What You Did Last Summer was 98. Scream was 96. Scream 2 was 97. So we're into a lot of kids are the audience and kids are the stars. Well, not kids. Young adult actors are the stars. The Nev Campbells, the people who are in TV shows that were also aimed at kids. Oh, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I guess for TV shows that'd be a good one to point out in the 90s for horror. I didn't even think about TV shows for this era. I can't think of any more. I'm probably missing something obvious, but I don't watch television anymore, so I can't really say about today's. Other than mentioning last time that Walking Dead. What did Stephen King? Stephen King in What's Scary talks about the Blair Witch Project in some length, and that's 99. That had a huge influence on the 2000s. So I mentioned most of that last time. Pardon me. And it did have a huge influence on the 2000s. There's a lot of documentary style, or stylistically it had a lot of influence. Documentary style or Super 8 style, or handheld amateur looking pieces to the film. And that's going to, I think that might continue even today, because camera phones. If you're going to have stuff on camera phones, if camera phones are being prolific, then horror movies are going to make use of something being caught on a camera phone. That's just a story waiting to happen. Movies that he talks about during this time, I've mentioned some of them already. Of course, the vampires, because From Dusk Till Dawn is one that he mentions and talks about and enjoyed for the last 15 years, from 95 onward. Scream was another one that he enjoyed, which is also part of the slasher genre. That's 96. Mimic was one that he talked about, and that's one of Guillermo del Toro's first English-speaking movies. Mira Sorvino, a few other people. Oh, Event Horizon was one that he mentioned, and that was very frightening, very haunted spaceship. Very creepy. Pi is one that he mentions more atmospheric than horror. Creepy atmosphere. P-I, Pi, not P-I-E. Deep Blue Sea, which was, for the Jaws types, super sharks. He says that he screamed out loud when a shark bit Samuel L. Jackson in half. And he likes movies that make him scream out loud. Stir of Echoes, he mentions. That's a Matheson being put into film starring Kevin Bacon. I'm not sure I don't remember who the director was. I actually didn't care for it myself. I guess it's a matter of taste. I'm usually scared of ghosts, and this is a ghost movie that didn't scare me. So, and it doesn't take much to scare me as far as ghost movies. I'm usually pretty friggin' frightened. And that one didn't do it. I don't know why. I can't tell you. And then going into the 2000s, that's all he mentions really for that. Other ones I found, Frighteners is kind of a horror comedy, but it was kind of frightening. Jake Busey as the Reaper guy, it's a ghost that can kill ghosts and people, so that's kind of frightening. Serial killer takes over the power of the Grim Reaper. That's kind of cool. Michael J. Fox was the main on that, main star. Jake Busey was the bad guy, but he was kind of not. He wasn't Jake Busey for long. You saw him as this Reaper thing, and that was kind of just, it was good special effects. Who was the? I think it was Peter Jackson, actually. Candyman was 92. I guess that is a supernatural slasher. Coming back from the dead slasher in kind of like Nightmare on Elm Street. Let's see. Start of the Japanese craze. There's Ringu, which of course became The Ring in 2000s. And The Audition, not really, 98 and 99 respectively. Not really one I want to talk about here. I want to save that for when I talk about cross-cultural horror. I want to talk about cultural horror anthropology. It was 1990, the remake of the Stephen King book put onto movie. Tim Curry. There's so many people in that movie. Tim Curry is, of course, it. Pennywise the Dancing Clown. Emily Perkins. And I'm jumping to 2000s again because I don't think I mentioned in the last video, because I'm going backwards. Ginger Snaps, which was made in 2000. If I didn't, I'm remiss in that. And it's one of the best werewolf movies in the last 20 years. Probably the best since American Werewolf in London. Well, of course, Wolf was in this section too. Wolf was in the 90s. So, and that's not bad, but that is not horror werewolf. It's superhero werewolf, which isn't horror werewolf. But Wolf was 94. Funny Games was 97. That's the original Funny Games that was remade in the 2000s for American audiences. Urban Legends I mentioned as part of the kids movie. That was 90. Movies with kids. That was 98. Bad Moon, the Mariel Hemingway werewolf movie that was based on the book called Thor. I think Thor. I think I talked about it during the werewolf section. It was alright. that was the one with the, I think I mentioned, had the really bad beginning. It had like the Cinemax topless, gratuitous topless scene in the beginning before the girl gets mauled by the werewolf, and the boy, the man, gets bitten, and that becomes the main character, the werewolf. That's Meryl Hemingway's brother. That's the one with the dog is the hero, because the dog is the only one that can sense that the werewolf is a werewolf when he's not a werewolf, when he's not in wolf form. Good idea. I think the book would probably be better, but I haven't read the book, so the movie was good, but not great. House on Haunted Hill, the Famke Janssen, was 99. Good ghost story. Freaked me out a bit. Faculty was 98. That's a teen. Aliens took over the teachers, and they're attacking the students, trying to possess the students or whatever. The Craft was 96. That's teen witches, and not a Sabrina style. It has its moments. It's not great. It's adventure-y at best. I Know What You Did Last Summer, and I Still Know What You Did Last Summer, 97, 98. Thinner was 96. That's a Stephen King remake. Oh, I got the Stephen King list here too, don't I? Yes, I do. Okay. We'll talk about Stephen King a bit too. Oh, shoot. I didn't pull up my other list. Beg pardon. Do. Talk amongst yourselves. I'm in... I moved it, didn't I? Novels. Yes. Oh, I should pull up this one too. Yes. Okay, so yes. Thinner. The last of the Bachman books. Well, almost the last of the Bachman books. Besides Blaze and, of course, Desperation from the one I'm going to talk about when I talk about Stephen King. The last of the Bachman books that wasn't supposed to be, when you weren't supposed to know that they were the same person. Was made into a movie in 96. Not bad. Kind of creepy. Not necessarily horror. Science fiction. Or magic-y. Creepy, though. The pie... The effects of the people eating the pie is kind of blah. Gross out. Has some gross out moments. That's what I'm after. Let's see. Phantoms was 98. Dean Koontz remake. The Ben Affleck and gosh, a lot of people actually. Arachnophobia was 1990. That's usually the one I use as the example for massification monsters, because it's a bunch of spiders working together or sort of working together, just so many of them, to take over a town or whatever. Tales of the Crypt, I went over both of those. Wolf was 94. Stigmata was 99. Josh Howard, this guy... Nope. Wrong button. This guy makes a point of... Later on in his video says, Stigmata is a movie where an atheist, a non-religious person, gets the stigmata, the bleeding palms and the bleeding back and the bleeding crown, the bleeding feet, the wounds of Christ. An atheist gets it. And if the atheist gets that, doesn't that make the monster God? And he makes an interesting point about that. It's an interesting point. And I'm not sure what to say about that. It's an interesting movie. I don't know how much highly I'd recommend it. I don't know how highly it actually counts as being horror. It's got some creepy elements to it. It doesn't strike me as horror, and I don't know if that's just because I'm buying into the Noel Carroll thing about the Noel Carroll thing about what a monster is, because God, you don't equate God as monster, whether you're an atheist or not. And The Haunting, and that's 99 as well. Uh, that's Catherine Zeta-Jones. That was, as far as CG goes, that's very creepy. I remember watching that at the same time I watched Blair Witch. Blair Witch creeped out my dad and my stepmom, and The Haunting creeped me the heck out. Like, I was okay with Blair Witch. It didn't bother me. The Haunting just freaked me out just because the special effects got in my brain. And it was great special effects. Plot-wise, it's supposed to be The Haunting of Hill House. It's not. It fails, because Haunting of Hill House, of course, is a fantastic, in the Todorov sense of the word, and this one isn't. It's obvious ghost. It's alright. I'd recommend it, because it's creepy. I think Luke Wilson, one of the Wilson boys. Luke Wilson? I don't know which Wilson it was. One of them was in it as well. The one lady who plays Eleanor is in so many things. And I know her by face, but I don't know her name. The doctor was also somebody I should know, but don't. I'm not going to think of it. Sorry. I do have my notes here that I wanted to pull up. No. Interview was in 1996. Scream was in 96. Misery was in 1990. Which is one that was supposedly the torture films that the predecessor to the 2000s torture films was Misery. I don't know if you could say that. I guess Urban Legends was also that sort of thing. But I don't know, it's kind of difficult to say where does slasher end and where does torture begin. If you have the slasher films in the 80s and 90s, and you have the so-called torture films from the 2000s with the Saw and the Hostel. Why aren't they slashers? Well, they don't do things quickly. I guess is that the only prerequisite? That's an idea to put out there. I'm not really sure about that. I'm gonna skip out, switch notes. The other notes. Boom. Oh, here's my. And speaking of slashers, sort of Genius Perfected. I don't know when the movie came out. The book version of American Psycho, Bret Easton Ellis, came out in 96. Sorry, 91. Maybe the movie came out in the 90s as well. I'm going to have to go on IMDb, so talk amongst yourselves. Oh, I hate doing this. It's so unprofessional. I can't spell psycho, apparently. Nope, 2000. Okay. Nope, I was prepared, really. So, as far as Genius Perfected, I guess in book form, you could say that Genius Perfected American Psycho as a Psycho movie. It's also a fantastic, because you don't know if he did it. I don't know if it beats Robert Bloch's Psycho, which is good. If you haven't read Bloch's Psycho, read Bloch's Psycho. In the 90s, you have, what else? No, it's the onset of Neil Gaiman, which is definitely a good thing. Not sure how much you could really class him as horror or fantasy, urban fantasy, maybe. But if you're a horror fan, you probably are a Neil Gaiman fan too, so I guess it's worth checking out. Poppy Z. Bright is one that started in the 90s. Um, Not really someone. It's altering from the horror as something scary. It's the horror romance, the paranormal romance, or in her case, I think it's even closer to paranormal erotica. His case, my apologies. Or it gets that way. And then you go and that sort of ties into the Laurel K. Hamilton from the 2000s. It's the predecessor of that. So Poppy Z. Bright. Yes, his stuff. Where am I? I mean, Clive Barker and Dean Koontz, Jack Ketchum have all been working. Richard Lehman, Ramsey Campbell, they all had stuff in the 90s, not stuff I can remember. And S.P. Somtow as well. So S.P. Somtow will be finishing up his main bulk of his work in the 2000s also. I don't have him there. Stephen King in the 90s, rather. Did I say 2000s? I think I did. I meant the 90s. Stephen King during the 90s didn't really have... He had a lot of books. This is his pre-getting hit by a car stuff. But when he's starting to go away from pure horror into dark sci-fi, dark fantasy. Well, he always did dark sci-fi and dark fantasy, but his novels that are horror, Needful Things, I guess would be pure horror. Rose Madder, Desperation and The Regulators, I guess would be closer to horror. Bag of Bones, it's the haunted lake. Storm of the Century, book. Screenplay, I guess, and movie. Movie was it's a demon messing with a town, or a demon type thing messing with that town. But he also did a lot of off horror. Dolores Claiborne, Gerald's Games. 4 Past Midnight, which I guess doesn't really count as horror unless you count... Well, it's horror-ish. Langoliers, Secret Window. I'm not familiar with the other two. Nightmares and Dreamscapes, it's short stories. He did have some horror stuff in there. Insomnia would be a fantasy. It's continuing the Dark Tower a bit. The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon and Hearts in Atlantis are not what I would call horror. Blood and Smoke, containing 1408, which he really raved about in moving form in the 2000s. And Blood and Smoke was pretty good. 1408 was pretty good. What were the other ones? The Crazy Waiter who's killing people while he's at a dinner with his ex-wife. Not what I would consider horror pure, but suspense. Alright, finished my water. Let's see. Yeah. Definitely good stuff in there, but only 3 or 4 horror novels, and a handful of horror short stories. I think that about does it. Next time we're going to the 80s, and of course we'll be going further with Josh Howard's here, and of course his, I'll pull up the 70s one to show you what's influencing the 70s, the 80s by the 70s. This is the really, as far as novels go, then we're going to go into Clive Barker, we're going to go into Dean Koontz, we're going to go into S.B. Somtow, when he's really popping out. There's a lot of good stuff popping out. Of course, I guess they sort of started in the 70s too. But the bulk of their stuff's going to be in the 80s. And then, of course, they're continuing on in the 90s and today. Both of them. And, of course, this is the 80s will be the heyday for Stephen King, which will have, your... Where am I at? Here we go. From Firestarter, Cujo, Running Man, Creepshow, different seasons, Pet Sematary, Cycle of the Werewolf, Talisman. No, that was post. That was the sequel to the Talisman was in 2000s. If I didn't mention that, I should have. It's not really horror though. It's good fantasy. Peter Straub also. Peter Straub, of course, is going to have stuff during the 90s as well. I don't remember which ones. Sorry. Thinner is the book form of Thinner. Skeleton Grew. Oh, some Bachman books in the 80s. And It in the 80s as well. So definitely some scary stuff in the 80s for King. I'm going to go over, of course, scary stuff from Barker and some of the Koontz. And then we're going to go with the 70s. We get to start playing with this again for his history. Yeah. Well, I get to make a lot more notes. Alright, folks. We'll continue tomorrow. It's my last fly alone day. I'm not even going to have What's That Scary to help me out for this next one. Oh, Dan Simmons. I forgot about Dan Simmons. Why did I forget about Dan Simmons? F. Paul Wilson as well. No, he's going to have stuff too. Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough is going to be in the 90s. I think she started in the 90s. It's difficult to find stuff on novels for the 90s. When I did web search, I said, I went onto IMDb and asked for lists of the movies of the 90s. Horror movies of the 90s. I got a lot. For novels, I did a Google search for novels of the 90s. I didn't get anything. I got novels of the 90s, but not horror novels of the 90s. The closest I came was kids' horror novels of the 90s. I guess it's worthwhile to point out that kids' novels of the 90s really blew up. This is the Goosebumps era. This is R.L. Stine. This is Pikeman? No, Pike. Christopher Pike. The scary stories targeted directly at kids. I know that there were so many Goosebumps books when I was a kid. I couldn't read them. I was so frightened as a child. I think I mentioned that before. I could not read them at all. I was just terrified. But the 90s were full of them. I guess they started in the 80s. Probably Goosebumps started in the 80s. And I'm sure there's, of course, ghost stories that kids tell each other. Go back forever. Any Boy Scout in the 50s knew got told ghost stories by the campfire. Or the 20s, or the 10s, or whatever, how far back, I don't even know how far back the Boy Scouts go. And then and before the Boy Scouts still happened, they still told scary stories to each other. But as far as publishing, 90s was a big heyday for it. Of course, it's still, you can go into any bookstore now and still find lots and lots and lots of Goosebumps books and other scary books as well. Scary tales to tell by the campfire. I remember trying to read some of those when I was in the 90s, when I was a youngster, and it frightened me. I couldn't handle it more than one or two. No, it would be maybe the 80s, but probably not the 80s. I probably started in the 80s, though. No, they definitely started in the 80s. I remember now. So we'll talk about that a bit more tomorrow. But there was a lot of heyday of that in the 90s. But I couldn't find any adult quintessential books. And I probably have asked this before. I'm going to ask it again. If you go onto Wikipedia and want to update their horror novels by decade, it's really, really sad. I think there was 10 horror novels by decade. 3 of them were Lumley books, the Necroscope series, books 5, 6, and 7, or 4, 5, and 6 for the 90s, which I barely consider them horror at all. I'll talk about them next time because they began in the 80s. I'll even recommend 1 or 2. But no. Anyway, folks, have a great night. I'll continue History of Horror tomorrow. This is Drew signing off for Horror Analysis.